The most powerful weapon on D-Day was not a tank, but a lie spoken by a ghost. The date is June 6, 1944. The surf at Omaha Beach is a churning soup of diesel oil and American blood. Men are dying by the thousands in the crossfire of German machine guns. But the true mystery of this morning is not the slaughter on the sand. It is the deafening silence 150 miles away. In the Pas-de-Calais, the terrifying 1st SS Panzer Division sits with its engines cold. The elite 116th Panzer Division is playing cards in the barracks. These tanks are the hammer that could drive the Allies back into the sea, yet they remain frozen in plea, ignoring the invasion at Normandy. They are waiting for a larger attack that will never come. They are paralyzed by the reports of a master spy who exists only on paper. How does a bald, failed chicken farmer from Spain freeze 2 Nazi armies with nothing but a fountain pen? How does a man rejected by the Allies become their greatest savior? To understand this deception, we must go back 3 years, to a dusty street in Madrid and a man with nothing to lose. In January 1941, Juan Pujol García was a nobody. His file describes him as a character of no consequence. He was 32 years old. He was balding, bespectacled, and utterly unremarkable. He had tried to run a chicken farm and failed. He had managed a hotel and failed. But beneath this boring exterior burned a cold, fanatical hatred for fascism. He had seen the Spanish Civil War tear his country apart. He decided he would not let the Nazis do the same to the world. He walked into the British embassy in Madrid with a simple offer. He wanted to be a spy. He had no training, no contacts, and no experience. The British intelligence officers took one look at this disheveled little man and laughed him out of the building. They saw a nuisance. They didn't know they had just rejected the greatest actor of the 20th century. Pujol did not give up. If the British wouldn't let him work for them, he would work for the Germans instead. He walked into the German embassy, but this time, Juan Pujol García disappeared. In his place stood a fanatical pro-Nazi Spanish government official. He ranted about the new order. He spoke of his desire to destroy England. He was electric, passionate, and utterly convincing. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was mesmerized. They didn't verify his background. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. They recruited him on the spot. They gave him a crash course in espionage. They gave him a bottle of invisible ink. They gave him $3,000 in cash and a code name, Arabelle. His mission was to travel to London and recruit a network of agents. Pujol took their money and their ink. He boarded a train, but he did not go to London. He went to Lisbon, Portugal. He sat in a cheap hotel room with a map of England he bought at a kiosk. He had never been to Britain. He didn't speak a word of English, and from that empty room, he began to build an army of ghosts that would eventually fool Adolf Hitler himself. Lisbon, 1941. In a cheap hotel room thick with cigarette smoke, Juan Pujol García sat hunched over a desk. He had no radio. He had no secret codes. He had no contacts in the British Admiralty. What he had was a blue guide to England, a Portuguese-French dictionary, a map of the UK, and a railway timetable that was 3 years out of date. With these pathetic tools, he began to construct a hallucination. He wrote letters to his German handlers in Madrid, pretending to be writing from London. He described the fog over the Thames. He complained about the bad food. He detailed the movements of troop convoys he had never seen. He fabricated an entire network of sub-agents to do his work for him. There was a KLM pilot who flew between Lisbon and London. There was a Welsh nationalist in Swansea who hated the English. There was a loose-lipped waiter in a Gibraltar naval base. None of them existed. They were ink and imagination. But to the Germans, they were real assets requiring real salaries. The Abwehr sent thousands of pounds to support this phantom army. money that went straight into Pujol's pocket. His reports were masterpieces of plausibility wrapped in ignorance. He calculated train travel times using his expired schedule, not knowing the war had changed everything. He reported that men in Glasgow would do anything for a liter of wine, unaware that Scots drank whiskey or beer and used imperial pints. He described heat waves in London during months when it was freezing. Yet the Germans were so desperate for intelligence, and his confidence was so absolute that they believed every word. They didn't see the errors. They saw a master spy operating in the heart of the enemy capital. By April 1942, the panic had crossed the Channel. But it wasn't the Germans who were panicking. It was the British. Inside the heavily guarded rooms of MI5 in Bletchley Park, British intelligence officers were intercepting secret German transmissions. The decrypted cables were terrifying. They revealed that the Abwehr had a high-level source in London, codenamed Arabelle, who was providing detailed reports on British morale and troop movements. The British launched a massive manhunt. They tore the country apart looking for this German super spy. They investigated diplomats, officers, and dock workers. They found nothing. Then an analyst at MI5 noticed the cracks in the mirror. The spy made strange cultural mistakes. He used old-fashioned terms. He didn't seem to understand the British currency system, and his descriptions of British locations seemed literary, as if lifted from a travel guide. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The spy wasn't in London. He was making it all up. They traced the source back to the rejected Spaniard in Lisbon. The embarrassment at MI5 was total. They had dismissed him as a crank, and he had successfully fooled the entire German intelligence apparatus on his own. They realized they had two choices: eliminate the loose cannon or weaponize him. They chose the latter. In April 1942, Juan Pujol García was smuggled out of Portugal and brought to London. He finally set foot in the city he had been describing for a year. He met with his new British handlers. They were stunned by his genius for deception. They gave him a new code name, one that fit his talent for acting. They called him Agent Garbo. The greatest double-cross in military history was about to begin. By the winter of 1944, the game had changed. It was no longer about inventing weather reports or fictitious drunk sailors. The fate of the free world now rested on a single colossal lie known as Operation Fortitude. The Allies were preparing to invade Europe. They knew the Germans expected an attack. They could not hide the invasion force, so they decided to hide the target. They would convince Adolf Hitler that the landings at Normandy were merely a feint, a distraction, and that the real killing blow would fall at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. To sell this lie, the Allies built a ghost army. In the fields of Kent, across from the Pas-de-Calais, they assembled the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. It was a magnificent force on paper. It had tanks, it had artillery, it had landing craft. But if you walked up to one of these Sherman tanks and kicked it, you would break your toe on an air pump. They were made of rubber and plywood. The barracks were empty movie sets. The radio traffic was a scripted performance of actors talking to no one. But a rubber tank looks like a rubber tank from 10 feet away. To make them real in the mind of the German High Command, they needed a witness. They needed a trusted voice to whisper in Berlin's ear, "I have seen them. They are real, and they are coming for Calais." That voice was Juan Pujol García. From his office in London, Garbo orchestrated a symphony of deception. He did not simply send a message saying, "The army is here." That would be too obvious. Instead, he mobilized his network of 27 imaginary sub-agents. He had them report from all over southeastern England. Agent 7-2, a fictional Greek sailor, reported seeing the shoulder patches of the American divisions. Agent 4-3, a non-existent American sergeant, accidentally leaked details of the landing schedules during a drunken night in a pub. Garbo collected these fragments of lies and wove them into coherent, high-grade intelligence dossiers. He reported that the legendary General George S. Patton, the commander the Germans feared most, was leading this new army. This terrified the Nazi leadership. They believed that where Patton went, the war followed. The Abwehr swallowed the bait whole. They were receiving hundreds of messages confirming the buildup in Kent. Every inflatable tank spotted by a German reconnaissance plane was verified by one of Garbo's agents on the ground. Berlin began shifting their panzer divisions away from Normandy and toward Calais. They were fortifying the wrong beaches, pouring concrete into the wrong bunkers, and aiming their guns at an empty sea. Garbo had turned the 1st United States Army Group from a joke into the most feared military unit in Europe, without it ever firing a shot. As May turned to June, the tension in Garbo's London safe house became suffocating. The real invasion fleet was gathering. The engines were being primed. The deception had worked so far, but the most dangerous moment was approaching. Once the first boot hit the sand at Normandy, the lie would be exposed. Unless Garbo could pull off one final, impossible twist. He had to convince the Germans that the invasion they were seeing with their own eyes was not the real invasion at all. The night of June 5th, 1944. While 150,000 Allied soldiers were praying in the bellies of heaving landing craft, Juan Pujol García was sitting in a quiet room in London, preparing to commit high treason. To save the invasion, he had to betray it. The plan was a masterpiece of calculated risk. To ensure the Germans would believe his big lie about the Phantom Army later, he first had to give them a piece of the truth. He had to warn them about the Normandy landings, but the timing had to be surgical. The message had to arrive too late for the Germans to stop the invasion, but early enough for the timestamp to prove that Garbo knew it was coming. He was building an alibi in Morse code. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6th, with the first waves of paratroopers already descending on France, Garbo sat at his transmitter. He began tapping out the call sign of his handler in Madrid. He tapped, and he tapped. But there was no answer. History often turns on the smallest of hinges. On the night the world changed, the German radio operator in Madrid was not at his post. He was asleep. For 5 agonizing hours, while men died on the beaches of Omaha and Utah, Garbo tried to deliver the most critical intelligence of the war, and the Nazi war machine slept through the alarm. When the German operator finally woke up and responded at 8 o'clock that morning, the invasion was already headline news. The opportunity for a prediction was gone. A lesser spy would have panicked. A lesser spy would have apologized. Juan Pujol García went on the attack. He sent a blistering message, furious and arrogant. He screamed across the radio waves, "I am disgusted! I endanger my life to send you the most critical intelligence of the war, and you are sleeping. I cannot work with such amateurs." It was a stroke of psychological genius. Instead of being suspicious why Garbo missed the warning, the Germans were apologetic. They were groveling. They begged for his forgiveness. By dominating them, he cemented his status as their most valuable, untouchable asset. He had turned a failure into absolute power. But the real test was yet to come. 3 days later, on June 9th, the situation in Normandy was critical. The Allies had a toehold, but they were vulnerable. The German High Command was waking up. Field Marshal Rommel was preparing to move the massive reserves, the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 116th Panzer Division, to crush the beachhead. If those tanks reached Normandy, they would push the exhausted Americans and British back into the sea. The deception was fraying. The reality of the invasion was undeniable. This was the moment Garbo played his final, terrifying card. He sat down and composed a message that was longer than anything he had sent before. It was a detailed, urgent analysis of the Allied dispositions. He acknowledged the fighting in Normandy, but he reframed it entirely. "I have reviewed the troop movements," he typed. "The present attack is a large-scale diversionary operation to draw our reserves away from the real target." He laid out the evidence from his fictional agents. He claimed that General Patton's Fusag army was still waiting in Kent, engines idling, ready to strike the Pas-de-Calais the moment the Germans moved their tanks west. "Do not be fooled," he warned. "The main blow is yet to fall." He sent the message, and then he waited. In London, the intelligence chiefs held their breath. This was the gamble. If Hitler believed the lie, he would keep his tanks in Calais, guarding against a ghost. If he saw through it, the panzers would roll south, and the invasion would fail. The fate of Europe hung on whether a paranoid dictator would trust the word of a chicken farmer over the advice of his own generals. The message from Agent Arabelle traveled from the radio set in Madrid through the frantic corridors of the Abwehr and landed directly on the desk of Adolf Hitler. It was a piece of paper that carried the weight of a death sentence for the Third Reich. The Führer read the analysis. He saw the confirmation of his own deepest fears, that Normandy was a trap, a feint designed to lure his forces away from the real battleground. He made his decision. He overruled his field marshals. He issued the order that would ultimately lose him the war. "Hold the reserves." In the Pas-de-Calais, the engines of the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 116th Panzer Division were cut. These were the most lethal armored units in the German arsenal, fully equipped, rested and ready to drive the Allies into the sea. And they simply sat there. For days, the German commanders in Normandy screamed for reinforcements. They watched their defensive lines crumble under the weight of the American and British advance. But the reinforcements never came. 150 miles away, thousands of German tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers spent their days scanning the horizon of an empty sea, waiting for a phantom army that existed only in the imagination of a Spanish chicken farmer. They waited through the rest of June. They waited through July. Even as the Allies broke out of the Normandy beachhead and began the liberation of France, the German High Command remained paralyzed by Garbo's lie. They were so terrified of General Patton's fictional army landing in Calais that they refused to move their units until late August. By then it was too late. The trap had snapped shut. The road to Berlin was open. British intelligence analysts later estimated that Garbo's deception had saved between 20,000 and 50,000 Allied lives. But the deception did not end with the success of the invasion. In a twist of irony that defies belief, the Germans did not realize they had been fooled. They believed Garbo had been right. They convinced themselves that the Fusag army had been real, but that the Allied strategy had simply changed at the last moment. In their eyes, Arabelle was the only spy who had accurately predicted the strategic threat. He was not a failure, he was a prophet. In December 1944, the absurdity reached its zenith. Juan Pujol García was summoned to a secret meeting with the British royal family. In a quiet ceremony, King George VI bestowed upon him the member of the British Empire, the MBE. It was one of the highest honors the kingdom could grant, a recognition of the man who had saved the invasion. Weeks later, a message arrived from Berlin. The German High Command, grateful for his extraordinary service and his heroic intelligence work, had authorized a special reward. By the personal order of Adolf Hitler, Juan Pujol García was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. Pujol asked his British handlers for permission to accept it. They laughed and agreed, and so the bald little man from Madrid achieved the impossible. He became the only person in the entire Second World War to receive top military honors from both the Allies and the Nazis. He wore the medal from the king who fought for freedom, and he accepted the medal from the tyrant he had personally destroyed. The Germans never knew that their Iron Cross was hanging on the chest of their executioner. The war ended in 1945, but for a man like Juan Pujol García, the shadows never really lift. He had humiliated the Third Reich. He had made fools of the most dangerous men in Europe. And while Hitler was dead, the Odessa network, the rat lines of escaping Nazis, was very much alive. Pujol knew that if the surviving SS officers ever discovered that their Arabelle, the hero of the Iron Cross, was actually a British agent who had cost them the war, they would hunt him to the ends of the earth. He had one final deception to perform. He had to kill Juan Pujol García. In 1949, with the help of his old friends at MI5, the news was quietly leaked. The great spy had traveled to Angola, deep in Africa, to investigate secret resistance movements. There, tragically, he had contracted cerebral malaria. The British ambassador attended the memorial. The files were closed. To the world and to the vengeful ghosts of the Nazi Party, the man known as Garbo was dead and buried in the African dust. He had died as he lived, inside a fiction he created himself. But the ghost did not die. He simply moved. He crossed the Atlantic and dissolved into the humidity of South America. For 35 years, he lived in Lagunillas, Venezuela. He did not run a spy network. He did not overthrow governments. He ran a small, dusty gift shop and bookstore. To his neighbors, he was just an old, quiet man with a thick beard and a love for reading. He taught Spanish to the children of oil workers. He walked his dog. Not a single person in that town, not even his new family, knew that the gentle old man behind the counter was the reason the Allies won the Battle of Normandy. He kept his secret sealed in a vault of silence that lasted 3 decades. It wasn't until 1984 that the silence was broken. A British author named Nigel West, obsessed with the history of the double-cross system, began to tug at the loose threads of the death in Angola. He tracked the ghost across continents, finally finding a phone number in Venezuela that belonged to a Juan García. The meeting was surreal. The spy who had outwitted Rommel was now a frail 72-year-old man. When asked if he was Garbo, he didn't deny it. He simply smiled, a flicker of the old actor returning to his eyes, and said he had been waiting for someone to find him. The resurrection of Garbo was the final shock of his incredible life. He was flown back to London, where he was reunited with the handful of surviving MI5 officers who had run him. But the true end of his story happened on the sands of Omaha Beach. On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Juan Pujol García walked onto the beach he had saved. He was surrounded by gray-haired American veterans, men who had stormed those sands in 1944. When they realized who he was, when they realized that this little old man was the reason the Panzer divisions hadn't crushed them in the surf, they didn't salute. They wept. They hugged him. For the first time, the man who lived in the shadows saw the faces of the people he had kept alive with his lies. He died for real in 1988. But in the archives of intelligence, he remains the ultimate paradox, the fake Nazi who was a real hero, the man who lied to save the truth, and the ghost who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not a bomb, but a story told by a man who doesn't exist. The evidence is fragmented. Some details remain disputed, but the core facts are documented in military archives, witness testimonies, and declassified files. And now, when the story is told, the silence feels especially heavy. Before my eyes, I still see that image of the old man standing on the beach, surrounded by the veterans who never knew his name until the end of their lives. That is exactly why I cannot simply close this file and forget. Because forgetting is the final betrayal we can commit toward those who fought the war in the shadows, ensuring that others could live in the light. If you listen to the end, it means this matters to you too. Just let me know you're here, that I'm not telling this into the void.